So thank you guys so much for having me here today. I'm excited to come talk about fossils. It's hard to not love talking about fossils, so I'm very excited to see folks interested in it. The one thing that I'll sort of toss out as a caveat before we go ahead and get started today is I really want to treat this sort of like a discussion. Thank you. I don't want to stand up here and just sort of talk at you for a while. So please, if you have questions or if there's something that I'm saying that you're like, oh, that's interesting, let's talk some more about it, please feel free to interject a question or a comment or something like that. I think that sort of helps drive discussion in really interesting ways. The other caveat that I would throw out is I sadly have not quite finished my Tom Child book yet, so you still have it's still in the process of being written here. And what the book is doing is it's looking at the history of famous fossils broadly. So the Tom Child is one of them. And one of the other ones that's going to be featured in this book is indeed a Neanderthal. So it was really exciting to be able to rummage through archives and research material and to think about what we wanted to talk about today. All right, so what do we have here? We have our friend the Neanderthal over there on the right, and that actually comes from a fantastic book. Yes?
Never mind.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so that makes for an easy question. All right, so the one thing that I'd also throw out here is if folks find that they're interested in the history of reconstruction or sort of how fossils get a face put on them, sort of who does the reconstructing and what sorts of stories does that tell us about how we think about the species, I would highly recommend John Gurch's book, Shaping Humanity. It came out a couple of months ago. John Gurch is the paleo artist who put together all of the reconstructions and the dioramas and the faces that we see, including the one over there on the right, as part of the Neanderthals, and his work is displayed in the Smithsonian in DC. So if folks are interested in that kind of, how do we imagine what a species that's extinct look like, I would highly recommend Gurch's book there. All right. So when we say Neanderthals, what do we mean? What is a Neanderthal and how do we think about them? So I wanted to put out these two examples here. It's sort of a juxtaposition of how we, I think as a culture, think about this species, this different kind of species. So the one on the top is actually one of Gurch's sculptures. It's a bronze sculpture that's a Neanderthal woman and a child. The Neanderthal woman is working with hides. She's holding it in her mouth. She's working with it. You can see when you get up close that she's actually sewing. It's part of that, and you see a child sort of looking at her and sort of absorbing this cultural moment. And the date for the installation of the sculpture is 2010. 100 years earlier, 1909, we have this guy sort of down there at the bottom, looking a little rough around the edges there. And the 1909 picture actually comes from the Illustrated London Times. It was a reconstruction of what a Neanderthal, what the artist imagined a Neanderthal would look like, based on the skull from France that was recovered in 1908. So we have these two different interpretations. We have similars. We have artists that are looking at similar bone data, similar fossil information, but they're coming away with very, very, very different interpretations of how do we think about this species. And so what I wanted to do today is to sort of explore the space in between this. We have sort of 100 years of Neanderthal research, and what do we see in the space between, and how we think about things differently. All right. But before we can sort of get into the early 20th century stuff, I'd like to pose this question of how do we think about not human? How do we think about species that are kind of like us, kind of like Homo sapiens, but we sort of want to distance and say, well, it's not us. And I point out that actually this question is incredibly old. This isn't, sadly, a new question in science and the history of science. That this question of how do we categorize not human is actually very, very old. We see, and I want to put out a couple of examples here. One is Carl Linnaeus, the botanist, the taxonomist, actually created a species that he called Homo troglodytes, which translates roughly as cave-dwelling man. Interestingly, although Homo troglodytes does not sort of exist in the vernacular taxonomy today, Pan troglodytes, or the chimp, does actually take its name from that original taxonomic designation. All right, so in 1758, Linnaeus is looking at this sort of what he imagines as another species, something sort of between a chimp and a human, sort of having some elements, right? We can sort of assign maybe some kind of culture to a sphere or some kind of technology to that. But on the other hand, it's still very, very not human, right? It's very furry. There are no clothes. There's a tail. You know, the guy over there, like 2 in, is sporting a tail. So it's still very not human, but it's sort of exploring the space of, wait a minute, what is it that makes us human? Is it taxonomy, is it morphology, sort of how our skeleton is put together? Is it technology, sort of the tools that we use? So Linnaeus is starting to play around with this. And while Linnaeus is a fairly well-known example, I wanted to bring out Chaucer here in 1731, is also sort of playing around with this space. Chaucer's work in Sacred Physics is a really interesting attempt to reconcile basically the Old Testament with taxonomy. So Chaucer is looking at the differences between the apes, the gorillas, the chimps, and saying, look, they look very similar to humans, but how do we account for sort of where they came from? How do we put a creation story on this sort of, how do we reconcile sort of the variation that we see in peoples today? If we were to look at it through the lens of how we think about science, we would today, of course, say that this is a very racist approach to science. This is very problematic. But the point that I want to emphasize here is that in 1731, there's an attempt to say, what is it that makes a species human and not human? All right, so just sort of setting the historical context for this. All right, so let's jump up here. Quest for Fire. Any takers? Does anybody see this? Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Good. I was afraid that I was going to have this great sort of moment of exploring this film, and I was just going to be up here yapping about a film nobody had seen. So, all right. So, Quest for Fire. What's happening in Quest for Fire?
Greg Olman goes camping in a nutshell.
That is probably the most brilliantly, succinctly put description of this film I have yet to. I'm going to write that down. Actually, yeah. Okay, so we've got some stuff. Anything else? Any other takers?
Well, there's a intermingling of different, I wouldn't call them species, but baby species. You couldn't tell from the film.
Exactly. It's really interesting. Well, what do we even call them, right? Any other? Yeah.
Well, they can't make fire, and their fire goes out in a rainstorm, so they have to fire someone else and bring it back.
Right.
And this is their quest.
Right. So yeah, so it's sort of all of these things that are stuck together. So we have a group of hominids, sort of largely agreed upon that they're modern humans, and we have another group of hominids, we sort of call them Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals can't actually make fire. They can use it in the film. The idea is that the Neanderthals can't actually make fire. They can use it, they can sort of keep it, but they can't actually make it. That the ability to create fire is this uniquely human aspect. And so the rest of the sort of 2 hours that the thing goes on is sort of this long drawn out quest for the ability to make and to create fire for the Neanderthals. And at the end, we sort of, the film finishes up with sort of the two species getting together, and then there's this sort of hybrid child that comes out of the end of the film.
You can use the black as a pointer too.
It's just like twitch. Yes.
In that film, they also seem to think about sex as much as modern humans did.
Yes, that is absolutely true. I think that would be the other sort of nutshell comment of they go camping and there's a lot of sex. the movie in a nutshell. All right. But I also wanted to point out that this question of sort of human, not human, Neanderthal and human is certainly something that still sort of captivates the imagination. So Quest for Fire was filmed in 1981 or 82, I believe. It was based actually on a short story that was written in 1908. So remember when I said that the original illustrations from the Illustrated London Times are coming out 1909? So in 1908, actually the original quest for fire was put out there. Sort of people are interested in exploring these themes. And again, 100 years later, we have that, the quest for fire. Robert Sawyer, Hominids, Humans, and Hybrids is an interesting trilogy. So for any sci-fi or fantasy folks, I would definitely recommend checking that out. Sawyer did a lot of research and really tried to make this effort to representing Neanderthals correctly as best as science today understands them. All right. So what's in the name? Where does the name Neanderthal come from? It comes from the Neander Valley in Germany. In 1856, there was a specimen of a Neanderthal that was recovered from the valley. It was found by a school teacher, Johannes Volkert. And Volkert sort of looks at it and says, oh, this is really interesting. He sends it off to other institutions in Europe to have other professional natural historians look at it and explore it and sort of say, well, what is it and how do I think about it? And in 1856, the jury was really out as to what this was. That this is the first sort of fossil ancestor that enters into the scientific record, and people don't quite know what to make of it. And so there's a lot of interpretation where people say, oh, it's simply a diseased specimen of humanity. I think that there were some early reports that said clearly it was a Cossack soldier from the Urals, and I mean, how else could you explain these like huge brow ridges? And so there's this sort of racist interpretation that happens in the 1850s, 1860s. Other scientists, though, in the 1850s and 1860s, including Thomas Huxley, look at that and say, look, the specimen that's coming out of the Neander Valley, this has a lot of characteristics that are a lot like humans, but they're different. They're more primitive. They're sort of earlier traits that would have happened in human evolution. And so Huxley and others look at that and say, no, this is a distinct species. We're going to call it Homo neanderthalensis, sort of from the Neander Valley. And we're going to say that it is a human ancestor. So at that point in natural history, the species was interpreted to be ancestral to humans. Today we sort of think about it as an evolutionary cousin or sort of a parallel lineage. But in 1856, it's seen as ancestral. I'm sorry, I thought I saw a hand. No? Okay. All right, so this is a sketch of the original fossil. It is actually, for those that are interested in history of biology specifically, the Neander Valley specimen is actually the type species for the Neanderthal species, or it's a type specimen for this species. The skull that's recovered, you can see this sort of looking down. If you were to look down at the top of the skull, straight on, you can see the hugely protruding brow ridges. And then again from the side. And we can I have a couple of slides that sort of put some of the anatomical characteristics side by side a little bit better. But this gives you a sense of what Huxley, what other natural historians like Owen are looking at as this question of, well, what is it and how do we think about it? As another interesting note, because I am a historian, I'm interested in the story, okay, so what comes before 1856? And what's interesting, I think, is that a lot of Neanderthal specimens were actually recovered before 1856. So in 1829, there's a specimen that's recovered from Gibraltar. In 1832 and in 1848, there are specimens that come out of Belgium and some other areas around Europe. So there's this growing sort of body of Neanderthal remains that are coming out of a European context. But until 1856, until there's a name and sort of a species concept that goes with it, there isn't a way of making sense of it. So you have these things, but you don't really know what category you could put them in. So until 1856, there really isn't a category. From 1856 to 1865 and later, when natural history museums realize that there's a name for it, there's a species for it, they start going back through their collections. And actually, the Gibraltar skull that was recovered in 1829 was found by a curator who basically just opened a drawer and started looking through this and said, oh, we've got this, I'd forgotten we had this. Sort of pulls it out and says, oh wait, this looks an awful lot like the skull that Huxley's talking about. So he sends some sketches and some photographs to Huxley, and Huxley confirms that it is indeed a Neanderthal. So what's interesting about this is that there are a lot of Neanderthals that are recovered before the species is named, but until there's an intellectual framework to be able to talk about the species as a species, the remains don't really have a home or an intellectual context to talk about them. I'd also point out that with the remains that are being recovered, after Huxley's work with the specimen and after the fossil is the 1856 fossil, the type specimen is published, archaeologists, natural historians begin looking at other things that would be associated with the bones themselves. They start recovering things like hand axes and other stone tools. Neanderthal stone tool technology is called Mousterian. So if you were to read through some articles, there's been a lot about Neanderthals. It's been in the news recently. If you were to read through and to read the Mousterian name, it's referring to the stone tool technology that's associated with Neanderthals. All right. So again, just to give you a couple of examples of what researchers are looking at. So people are looking at them. They're trying to make sense of them. What are they seeing? The French Ferrasi skull. My French is atrocious, so I will just put that out there right now. The skull from 1909. The La Moustere skull, 1909 as well. The La Moustere skull is the first skull that's recovered that actually has the stone tool technology directly associated with it. There's no question that whoever these bones belong to had something to do with the stone tool technology that's being recovered with it. So the Mousterian technology gets its name from the site La Moustere. I think that's what, yeah. All right, 1908. I had to throw this guy in. We did see the skull floating around in the earlier stuff before we started our discussion. In 1908, there was a skull that was recovered from La Chapelle, Austin. It was nicknamed the Old Man. So you would see these references in the Illustrated London Times to the Old Man of La Chapelle. And I had to throw this guy in because this is the fossil that I'm including in my book. So it's sort of nostalgic to put it in. I also wanted to point out that these are parts of the skull that simply were not recovered during excavation. This doesn't indicate any kind of catastrophic end to the poor guy. These are just parts of the skull that haven't been recovered. All right. So Huxley, we talked a bit about Huxley before. So Huxley's book, Man's Place in Nature, was considered a follow-up, very much a follow-up to Darwin's early work about evolution and Darwin's own stuff. And if we want to sort of explore the space of what's going on in early natural history, we can certainly go that direction. So Huxley's book, Man's Place in Nature, explores a lot about different tenets of Darwin's theory of evolution. But what's interesting is that as Huxley is looking for evidence for the antiquity of man, sort of how do you talk about humanity having this long geologic place, this place in the geologic record, Huxley does look to the Neanderthal skulls as evidence for that, and certainly includes some sketches. He includes some measurements. There's a lot of what we would call today completely tripping over the word. Anthropometrics, which is the measurement of anatomy and skeletal structures with that. So certainly Neanderthals are entering both the scientific community through these publications and through the work of natural historians, but they're also entering the public consciousness through things like the Illustrated London Times. And I want to emphasize the sort of dual place with that. All right, again, we've got a frontotype to sort of make it a little bit larger. What's interesting here is it tries to account for some of the anatomy that we were seeing before. So if we were to go back here, we sort of see these giant brow ridges. We see sort of these large eye sockets. We see a huge nasal cavity. We sort of see not much else, right? There's no sort of body to put with it. There's just the skull. But that doesn't deter, our dedicated artists here at the Illustrated London News. So here we sort of see something that has large brow ridges. We see a huge nose. But other than that, we sort of see it very hunched over. right? It's very stooped. There's nothing that in the anatomy or of the fossils that were recovered that would support that. We see sort of very crude tools. They're not sophisticated. They don't require a lot of work to make. We see sort of a rocky shelter. It does kind of look like something that's directly out of Quest for Fire, I'm loath to admit. But this is very much sort of what a Neanderthal would look like in the popular conception, and certainly in some scientific circles in the early 20th century. Alright, so I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of how we think about Neanderthals today, and then start to explore that space in between. So Neanderthals have been in the news quite a bit recently, thanks in large part to the finishing, and I was excited to sort of hear us starting to talk about the genome here at the beginning, thanks in large part to the final sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. And so there are lots of questions within the scientific community about how we ought to think about the Neanderthals, and certainly sort of what the relationship is between modern humans, Neanderthals, how much of the genetic codes are similar, what does this say about the antiquity and the history of the species. We can certainly get into that. I also wanted to throw out this picture of stone tool technology to point out that there are many lines of evidence that paleoanthropologists and archaeologists look to be able to understand Neanderthals, sort of what was going on in their culture and their social structure, all of these things. That it's not just the genome. The genome is very exciting and tells us a lot about Neanderthals and sort of early Paleolithic populations. But it's not the only way to make sense of a species and to think about a species. Looking at things like the stone tool technology over there on the right is a really useful line of evidence for archaeologists to be able to ask other questions. Alright, so what's the Neanderthal range? Where did Neanderthals live? We see definitely emphasizing Europe. We see them going through the Levant, the Middle East, and we see them out, the furthest documented east is actually a site called Tajik in Uzbekistan, and there's a possibility of a specimen that's been recovered from northern Russia up there. So we definitely see a very specific geographic range. They were well adapted for cold northern climates. We can talk about the physiology that goes along with that. But we certainly don't see Neanderthals anywhere else that we see. For example, Australopithecines or later Homo sapiens. Nothing in Europe, or nothing in Africa, Asia, or Australia. So they are very specific to their location. Yeah?
Pardon me. Were they thought to have originated or have an earlier ancestor from Africa?
That's a fantastic question. And it's a question that the best way to answer it is it depends. But yes, the best sort of candidate for an ancestor for Neanderthals is a species called Homo heidelbergensis. It appeared about 500,000 to 300,000 years ago, and it is thought to have an African origin at that point. But Homo heidelbergensis is also thought to be the sort of species that would be the best ancestor for humans and Neanderthals. And we do see Homo heidelbergensis primarily in the European and in the Middle Eastern area, but certainly the Homo heidelbergensis ancestry would be out of Africa.
And would Homo erectus be one of his ancestors?
Yeah, exactly. Homo erectus would have come from the heidelbergensis lineage as well. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So this map, what time range would that represent?
That's a great question. So here, actually let me jump to this one. I think that this is a little bit more, it shows you a little bit better detail and gives you some site names here. So with this, we see Neanderthals 500 to 300,000 years ago coming out of here, sort of Central Europe. There's some evidence that here in England and actually in Wales that they're as old as 300,000. Generally, those sites date to around 100,000, 150,000 years ago. Sadly, the sites over here at Tajik some of the eastern sites aren't well dated at all. So when they were excavated in the early 20th century, specimens weren't taken for soil sampling or obviously any kind of radiometric dating. So with some of the sites out here, particularly to the east, it's sort of a best guess in terms of the geologic age that would be associated with them. But for Neanderthals in general, we see them appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago, and we see them leave the fossil record about 30,000 years ago. So that's the sort of time frame that we have with that. Yeah?
That map looks a little bit north of the deep ice.
Yes, that's a brilliant observation, actually. And certainly, we see Neanderthals and their anatomy, which I think is actually my next slide, so it's a great segue. With that they are completely cold adapted. They are a cold adapted species, and we can talk about the specific elements of the anatomy that go with that. But certainly, Neanderthal researchers are looking at the sort of waxing and waning of the ice ages in order to be able to find sites that would most likely yield Neanderthal remains. Yeah.
What evidence is there for that little bit in Africa and across the Sinai there?
Right. So here we actually, the best evidence that we see coming out of that are actually two sites in Israel. One is called Kibara and the other is called Ketzpa. And the Neanderthals that were excavated there in the 70s. There isn't actually a site in Egypt. The best guess, though, for being able to include that as part of the geographic range is simply that it shares geographic characteristics. That the paleo environments that we would have seen from the sites in Israel are also shared here, and so there isn't a reason to exclude it. And certainly, in times past, we wouldn't have had quite so much rift there, and so it's considered a best guess. But there aren't Neanderthals that are recovered from Egypt specifically. It's a great question. Any other? I thought there was. Great. All right. So since we were talking about anatomy, let's talk about some of the differences in anatomy that we see between Neanderthals and modern humans, and then talk about sort of what this means for Neanderthals being so fantastically cold adapted hominids. All right. So here we have two examples, Shanidar and La Ferrasi. La Ferrasi is the specimen that we talked about earlier. Shanidar is actually a cave that is in Iraq. Interestingly, there's a team of researchers there currently who are re-excavating the site of Shanidar. But Shanidar was originally excavated in the 1950s. And La Ferrasi was excavated in 1908. All right, so sort of a broad summary statement here. We have very different anatomical characteristics between Neanderthals and modern humans. So in Neanderthals, we see what's back here. It's called an occipital bun. So there's sort of an elongation of the brain case. It almost looks like it's been squished down, which is a terrible analogy for using to describe anatomy, but I can't really think of a better turn of phrase. So you have this sort of occipital bun back here. Sort of have a long, flat brain case. So if you were to look here, there's no occipital bun. The brain case sort of sits higher. Here we have a low receding forehead. Here there's a high forehead. Very small nose. Very, very large nasal cavity. Very strong brow ridge. Here in Neanderthals, you see a projecting midface, so it would be almost as if you were to take this part of your face and push it out. That's what the projecting midface would look like with the Neanderthals. And here, there's actually, in modern humans, we don't have a gap behind the third molar. Most of us don't even have a third molar. It's your wisdom tooth, and you probably had it removed. But in Neanderthals, there is actually a gap that would fit behind there, almost like there's space for another tooth. That there's that much gap back in the Neanderthal mandible. Also, there is little to no chin. So sadly, there's some sort of Kirk Douglas of the Neanderthal family. But we definitely see the existence of a chin in modern humans. So this is a suite of characteristics, all right, that we can sort of work through. And as we work to say, well, what is the species? If we're to define the species based strictly on anatomy, here is a list of anatomical characteristics that sort of help us sort these into two different categories. All right, now if we were to sort of put the postcrania, or the rest of the body here with the Neanderthals, what would we see? So modern humans, much taller. Neanderthals, much shorter. Again, talking about the lower cranium, so again, that shape of the cranium. Neanderthals have a very large, broad rib cage, and certainly the next slide has a great picture of that. Neanderthals also have a larger elbow joint, shorter forearm, larger ankle joint, and there are all of these characteristics are characteristics that you would see for a cold-adapted species. All right, so here, sort of the skeleton stripped bare. We can see the difference, certainly in the chest area. So Neanderthals are going to be very barrel-shaped, very squat, very, very broad. They're going to have much shorter relative arms than modern humans. And again, they're going to have this very very, very heavily, very robust, very large articulated joints in the knees and the ankles. Yeah?
You're talking about the body morphology. I mean, there's a tremendous range among modern humans. Eskimos were showing this one.
Right. We see so much variation in modern humans. Are you asking?
So when you make that comparison to some average,
it's very difficult. You're right that this is difficult to be able to make these kind of comparisons. And it speaks to actually this really interesting, I'll put out a question and then I'll come back and answer your question. So if we were to guess how many specimens of Neanderthals have been recovered, what would our sample size look like? How many Neanderthals? Any takers? Yeah.
Something like 400.
You stole my thunder. Congratulations. No, I'm really impressed actually. But I was going to get all excited that we thought that there were like 3 or something. But no, you're right. There are about 400 in the fossil record. And so in that sense, when we talk about, well, is this a fair Neanderthal to use? It's probably it's a conglomeration of all of these characteristics that come from different parts of Neanderthals that are represented throughout that. So it's a pretty decent sample of being able to look at what makes this morphology. Your question then is, so what do you compare it to? You know, is that sort of your question? It's sort of how do you create a fair comparison? And certainly, studies would look at and compare different regional variations of humans. But what the best comparison would be sort of at the same latitude and the same longitude, being able to compare sort of across an environment. But certainly there are well-documented studies within sort of human physiology of what do we mean when we say an average person that sort of takes into account these questions of huge variation. So at that point, I guess I would feel comfortable saying that that certainly there are ways to sort of account for that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Use one follow.
Yeah, of course.
How come there's 400, but how many complete?
Yeah, you should turn to your colleague behind that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there are approximately 10 or 15 complete skeletons, not that many. And so when we talk about these characteristics, we sort of talk about them as we assemble them from a lot of different skeletons. So this skeleton has, a crania and a forearm, and this skeleton has, a leg and maybe a pelvis. And so we put together the characteristics from that. However, what's interesting, though, about the 400 Neanderthals that are recovered is they do represent both sexes fairly evenly, and they also have a pretty good age range. So there are some recovered infant Neanderthals, there are some juvenile Neanderthals, and then there are Neanderthals that are incredibly old, particularly within their society. So there is that. Yes?
What is incredibly old for a Neanderthal?
What is incredibly, any takers?
60?
30, you're actually not that far off. About 40. 40 is the oldest Neanderthal recovered. Yeah?
You must have a lot of modern human specimens from 40,000 years ago. So can you give us an average adult male height and weight of each of both species?
Sure. So adult male Neanderthal would stand probably about 5'8". So not that tall.
Well, that's almost virtually as tall as modern
Modern humans. So we see sort of 5'8" is considered. There are some that measure around 5'4", 5'5". Sort of, if you were to sort of look at it in terms of median, but an average would be about 5'8". So that might answer your question of that range there.
Well, how about modern humans in 40,000?
About 40,000 years ago? Let's see, I think that it comes in at about, I think it's 5'9" or 5'10", actually.
That's only
Homo erectus, there is a specimen that's been recovered that measures about 5'11" or 6 feet tall. So Homo erectus is much taller. Is there another? Okay. Yeah.
Actually, you mentioned you found some infants.
Yes.
Does that give any indication of how developed the newborn Neanderthals were in comparison to Homo erectus, or something like? To my untrained eye, the pelvis looks fairly similar. Like, did they have the same constraints over
Sure.
birth canal size and all that kind of
No,
thing?
that's a fantastic question, and the answer is actually they're very different. The shape of the pelvis and the pelvic inlet are actually very different between Neanderthals and modern humans, Homo sapiens. The question of being able to establish like an infant mortality curve or anything like that for Neanderthals, I can't think of a study off the top of my head that does something like that. But certainly one of the interesting aspects that speaks, I think, a little bit to your question is that within Neanderthal society, they were actually very good at caring for people sort of as a social cohesive unit. So you see in some of that completely ancient specimen that was 40 years old, the guy had some debilitating injuries. He wouldn't have been able to survive without the sort of help of a social group that goes along with that. And the same with some children that have been dated to about 5 or 6 years old. That would have been 5 or 6 when they died. They couldn't have made it to 5 or 6 without sort of a social group that's there to help them. So while there isn't a specific infant mortality curve, we do know that certainly within the sort of care and feeding and the social structure of Neanderthals, we do see them behaving in behaviors that we would probably describe as modern human. So, yeah.
What about the gestation period? I mean, the further you go back towards monkeys, the shorter it gets. Would it have been the same for Neanderthal as it is for us?
Actually, I think the study that I'm thinking of gave around 10 months for gestation for Neanderthal. So, yeah.
I heard, I believe, that Neanderthals reached adulthood at a younger age as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the sort of height and weight would fill out around, I think 11 or 12 for males. I think is sort of maybe 13. Again, we do have this awesome set of 400. They're not all sadly, they're not 400 at the particular age that we would ask. But I have in mind that it's around that. All right. All right, so I wanted to, in addition to talking about the skeletal morphology and all of these sorts of exciting things, I wanted to